you?
Okay, super. Thanks so much, Sigrun. Yes, I'm very proud to be here. Also as a former team member of the China Center at TU. And let me share our presentation here. I hope you can see it. So, is it okay?
We see not yet the full screen mode.
You don't see the full screen mode, but now.
Yes, perfect.
Yes, okay, super. So this is what we are going to talk about, and just very briefly, I will introduce you how this whole thing, this whole topic came up. So first of all, why are narratives important for us? Um, um, there is a very interesting article from Lakoff and Frisch back from 2006. Um, on the war on terrorism, and they start their article with this sentence: "Language matters because it can determine how we think and act." And in the paper, they elaborate on the idea that after 9/11, what happened was defined as a crime. Um, and very soon after, instead of crime, they started using the word war. And of course, I mean, if you have a crime, you have one specific train of action, but if you have a war, you have an absolutely different way to handle things. So this is actually very telling on how the way we interpret things, the way we see things, influence our actions. Um, uh, I'm sure you are all aware of the fact that narratives are really ubiquitous. So they are all around us, they are in us. We bring our narratives with us, and they are absolutely, absolutely necessary. So they are badly needed to understand what is going on. I mean, what is happening all around? So I find this image, what happens in the brain without storytelling and with storytelling, um, very telling, because that's exactly what happened. So stories give answers to our big questions of why. Why is this happening to me or to us? So either on the personal level or on the level of community. And of course, as I've just said, narratives also give answers or suggest possible ways of action if we start asking ourselves, what am I to do, or what are we to do? Um, so um, so the question came up actually, I mean, came up several times during the past few years. What stories do we actually tell about China in these turbulent times? And also the other way around. I mean, what stories do China, the Chinese, if there is such a thing, or do our Chinese partners tell us in these times? Because we really live in times of big changes, really very huge global changes. Um, the circle where the question most often was brought up is the circle of Qian. The full name is China in Europe Research Network. You can see the website, link for the website there. That's where I coordinate a working group which is called Public Diplomacy and Knowledge Production. Actually, we will add narratives to the name very soon. And uh, it started as a kind of self-reflexive process because we started asking ourselves, so how do we fit into this whole thing? How our research reflects whatever is going on in global politics, in China, in Europe, whatever. And we kept returning to narratives, especially those ones like Sigrun as well, who work or partly work on media. So it became just such an important question, and so the idea of an edited volume came up. And this volume is coming out in 2 months, so by Bristol University Press. You can see the title there, and Duncan and I are two members of the editorial team. The other two people are not with us today, but I mean, we have all contributed a lot of work. What we will do now is we will briefly introduce our chapter because I think I mean, it's a good example or a good kind of illustration of what we are actually talking about when we talk about narratives today. And then we will also give a short summary of what we have found in the whole volume as a team. The volume has 12 chapters altogether, and all 12 are different. So we have collected a whole bunch of various topics. So we cover various countries, various media for narratives. So it's a very diverse volume. And at the end, we will also give a short summary of the volume, and there will be a time for Q&A after that. So now I give the floor to Duncan, because in our chapter, Duncan's part comes first. So, Duncan, floor is yours.
Hey, well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here and for the opportunity to present not only our chapter, but also, I mean, our book, which, as Agota has already said, it really covers a very diverse, non-exclusive set of subjects and far from comprehensive set of subjects on narrative between China and Europe. So we focused on this topic of dual circulation, which probably everybody who's been aware of China for the last few years knows that it became, at least for a while, and this is a subject perhaps for discussion, but it became, at least for a while, a key narrative, if you like, a policy framework, but a narrative about the relationship between the Chinese economy and the international economy. And so we decided to focus on this, and to look at the creation of the dual circulation narrative within China, and also the response, the narratives about China's narrative, if you follow, that began to appear outside of China, and especially in Europe, but it also looks a little bit at the United States as well. So very briefly, without spending too much time on it, because it's a complex subject, but so China really initiated this narrative of dual circulation in 2020. There was a Politburo meeting, after which the narrative or dual circulation was announced as being a new strategic direction for the Chinese economy. And it's very much associated with Xi Jinping himself. It was sort of embedded in the discussion, in Xi Jinping's ideology, and really you can see the historical, clearly the historical derivation that because Xi Jinping, his thought is associated with Marxism, Leninism, Deng Xiaoping thought, and so he is the follower of all these precedents in terms of the general ideological direction of China, and the dual circulation is framed within this, and it's framed as a a new stage, a new concept, and a new pattern of development for China, and it's based on this analytical framework of Marxist political economy. So it provides a framing of the Chinese economy, and at the same time, it provides an analysis of where the Chinese economy stands, and a framing for policy application for the future direction of the Chinese economy. The next slide. More broadly speaking, as Agota has already said, well, our narrative really has become a key part of the social sciences and international relations, the discussion of international relations. And one of the classic, if you like, definitions there in that first paragraph I have from Roberts of really what Agota has already been talking about. Narratives construct personal and social identity, provide sense and order of experience, and frame and structure action. So they provide really almost a universal framework, although very divergent frameworks of views of the world and action in the world. And what we discuss is this narrative of this dual circulation and the how it frames the Chinese economy and the response outside of China. More specifically, what we use in our chapter is this theory of strategic narratives, which really are in international relations, framing of action with a past, a present, and a future, which is turned towards not just the domestic audience, but also is in this model intended to influence external actors as well as domestic actors. So the strategic part of this narrative is directed not just domestically, but also externally. So the next slide. So yeah, and so we follow Skimmon and others who have written about strategic narrative, and in the past also the narrative related to China and Europe, in particularly in their case about the Belt and Road Initiative. But this is a framing which has been used a lot in talking about narratives in relation to China and Europe, especially COVID, and narrative, the idea of narrative battles, competition in narratives, and so on. So the next slide. So a brief picture. This is something I put together some time ago, which if sort of tries to clarify exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about dual circulation. So this is the sort of visualization of how the world is seen pre-dual circulation. So the relationship between the Chinese economy and the rest of the world, the international economy, where there was this model of what was basically dependent on processing of imported parts, materials, and so on, and then re-exporting to the rest of the world. And this is a model which really served China for close to about 30, 40 years from the 1980s onwards. I mean, this was essentially the Deng Xiaoping model of the relationship between China and the rest of the world. So the argument for dual circulation is that this model now no longer serves China's purposes. So we move to a new model of the relationship between China and the world. So this is the past. We have a present, and then dual circulation, at least in theory, was to be the future of the Chinese relationship with the rest of the world. So the next slide. So this is what you have in the new model of the world. And down below on this slide, you can see that I put actually a lot of the key concepts which have been used, particularly by Xi Jinping when he talks about dual circulation. And these are filtered through into academic discussion, into discussion by think tanks, and also in discussion in the media of dual circulation. So remembering this sort of top-down model, if you like, of creation and transmission of these kind of ideological concepts in China, this is what we find is that there's discussion by Xi Jinping in particular, who is associating himself with this model. And then you find it being disseminated, not necessarily in exactly the same terms. There are variations, there are additions in the media by academics and so on that develop the concept, but nevertheless it's closely associated with him. And so what you see is that in this new dual circulation model, China, rather than the external world, becomes the mainstay of development of the Chinese economy. It's focused on what is the domestic circulation, the domestic market, consumption, the strengths of the Chinese economy, and so on. And then there is the relationship between China and the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is described in these terms by Xi Jinping himself as being some of the key concepts: complicated, instability, uncertainty, protectionism, a downturn, a shrinking market, and weaker. So that is the relationship between China and how China sees the external world in this model, and why domestic development, the domestic market, the domestic consumption becomes increasingly important. So I'll go to my last slide, I think, here. And so this was really given its fullest elaboration in the 14th five-year plan, which was published, promulgated in March 2021, where it became part of the guiding ideology of the five-year plan, and part of its, as it says here, the strategic orientation of the five-year plan. So this dual circulation concept, the narrative of the relationship between China and the external world, and the future development of the relationship between China and external world became really a central element in the 14th five-year plan. So that, I think, is where I will stop. I hope I haven't taken too much time, but then Agota will talk about how this was received outside of China.
Yes, thank you so much, Duncan. So it's my turn again. I examined the reception and response to whatever was coming from China, we picked this topic, which might actually seem awkward. What would you do? Narratives on dual circulation, but it was a very, very conscious decision on our part, because we wanted to work on something that was novel in Europe and in the US. So we wanted to have something to double check how a new way of action, vision for the future coming from China gets received. And dual circulation seemed to be that. So you can say, especially the concept as it is, it was a blank sheet of paper for the three countries that I examined: the US, the UK, and Germany. And actually, this whole research, which I conducted actually way back, so it was like 3 years ago that we did it. It was a very, very exciting journey for me, because as I first started collecting materials, primary sources for the research, and started reading through them, and first I just started sorting them out. So what resembles what are the main topics? And then there came a point when I suddenly realized I have already heard that somewhere. So there was this point where, oh, that's not new. And it was then that I started digging a bit deeper into the whole theory of narrative templates. I had not known about narrative templates before, but they turn out to be very handy for this research because what we have found was basically that um, there is something that is supposed to be new, but it falls on a ground where there are already several narratives, or as I would say, narrative templates, patterns for stories. And I mean, we also have a definition here on the slide. And it turned out, as I was done with collecting the material and really sorted, categorized them, it turned out that they basically fell into three distinctive patterns or templates. The first one, which was characteristic of the first stage of receiving this narrative, was what we call the reactive China template, which sees China's dual circulation vision or strategy as a consequence of whatever happened outside of China. So it's basically a necessary step from China as a reaction to the trade war, COVID-19, everything. The second template came somewhat later, and I called it the closed China template. Which basically said that oh no, China shouldn't go that way because it means closing again. So it's a diversion from the famous opening policy. And there were also voices saying, no, don't do it because it will be bad for you. Not just or not that it will be bad for us, it will be bad for you. So listen to us. And template 3 was that also came later, so in the later stage of the period that I examined, was the rival China template, which is actually a very well-known template. I mean, China as the big other we are going to have a conflict with. So, or we are already in a conflict with. And it's just a mean thing, again, coming from China. They are doing it to us, and it's just not nice. And actually, I have brought 3 books with me. I will show them later on. So you can track these templates back in time, actually way back in time. So it was, I mean, still now that I talk about it, it gives me goosebumps how far in time you can travel back if you follow these narratives. So these are a few findings. So they actually, as I said, they are templates, but the way we reacted, these templates, especially the final 2 ones, so the closed China and the rival China, they can also be regarded as strategic narratives from our side because they give advice reported to China, partly to our own political decision makers, people working in China, how we should handle China, so to say. What we also found was that there was a certain amount of cross-referencing, that is, media outlets borrowed texts from each other, or wrote new pieces relying on what they had found somewhere else. But unfortunately, the sample was too small to be able to find a pattern in this. So this is something for researchers for the future. And what might not be a surprise to most of you, so most media used actually secondary rather than primary sources. So little reliance on Chinese language sources. This was a bit different in the materials that I collected from think tanks. Duncan, again, floor is yours.
Okay, so if we're stepping back from our particular chapter, what we thought we would do is just share some more broader conclusions drawn from the book. And these are in no particular, I think, sort of order of importance, and perhaps in this discussion not particularly well structured, but at least what I thought what would be good is to share a few conclusions and maybe hopefully raise a few questions and stimulate a bit of a discussion. So one of the perhaps more self-evident conclusions is that certainly on dual circulation is that in China you have a sort of centrally structured and propagated narrative of dual circulation directly associated with Xi Jinping, although certainly we shouldn't assume that Xi Jinping one day was scratching his head in Zhongnanhai and thought, oh, dual circulation sounds like a good idea, a good way to describe the relationship between China and the rest of the world. We know that there is a whole structure of think tanks, advisors, and so on, academics who produce these ideas in China. Some may be taken up by the leadership and some may not. I mean, the idea of circulation as used to describe the relationship between China and the rest of the world in economic terms is not a new concept. But this particular iteration of circulation is a new way of framing the discussion. And a lot of the ideas actually included within dual circulation actually are not particularly new. The idea that China needs domestic consumption is certainly not a new idea. This has been under discussion in China for at least a decade or more. But nevertheless, as is often the case in China, these kinds of concepts are not particularly well defined sometimes. They're not clearly defined. And also one of the things which we found quite clearly in this case, although we haven't really addressed it here, is that actually the projection outside of China was quite weak, or in fact very weak. And the most obvious example to compare it with is the BRI, where there was a huge investment of resources by the Chinese government to project the BRI outside of China. Anybody who's been involved with China for the last decade or more, how many seminars organized by whatever Chinese entities have you been to talk about the BRI? Or every time you meet a group of Chinese academics or think tanks, we talk about the BRI. Or we talked about the BRI. So there was a very weak investment in projection by the Chinese government in dual circulation. So one of the things we found is that, in fact, this weak projection by the Chinese government means that the dual circulation narrative was also quite, well, it was, as Agota said, a bit of a blank page. It left foreign actors, the foreign audience, a lot of room to interpret what this actually meant. And in terms of, if we go back to strategic narrative and the idea that part of the object of a strategic narrative is to influence the actions of external actors, then arguably this has had very little impact on the external actors outside of China in terms of their own action. So the next page, more generally, our conclusions were that especially in this time of uncertainty, complexity, change, Xi Jinping talks about once in 100-year changes, and quite clearly, even today, on this particular day, we face uncertainty and complexity in the relationship or the role of the United States in the global system. Narratives become more important than they perhaps would be otherwise in more stable times. And what we find, or we argue, is that narratives about China, which have these deep roots that persist, are extremely important in helping to interpret the world that we are in, and to formulate action in this world. Although at the same time, we have changing narratives, or at least the iterations of perhaps these deeper narratives change. And also there, at the bottom of the slide, quite clearly, what is important is external actors. It's not just that bilateral relationship which Europe has with China. The narratives are not necessarily formed just in this bilateral relationship. They are quite clearly formed in relation to external actors, notably in this case, the United States and its relationship with China, which has become increasingly complex, increasingly conflictual, and which has quite clearly an important impact on how China is narrated within Europe. So next slide. So yeah, uncertainty. I mean, there are people who've discussed this before. The uncertainty of the world necessitates narratives. Questions which we leave open and which we can discuss perhaps is whether the objective changes in the EU-China relationship bring about changing narratives, or do changing narratives change the reality of the relationship? Chicken and egg argument, perhaps, and perhaps it's a circular argument. We argue also that we have a responsibility, perhaps as researchers, as academics, and perhaps also policymakers, to be careful about the language. We have a responsibility about the language we use and the narratives that we use in all circumstances, but perhaps particularly in the relationship with China. And of course, perhaps, as of today, or even in the past, the relationship we have with the United States. And also a question which we don't address in the book itself and in a lot of academic work on narratives, the relationship between narratives and reality, if there is an objective reality, is left aside. We take narratives at face value. We don't address whether they are true or untrue, or they are based in reality or not based in reality. But of course, this is an important question, especially if we're talking about policy orientation and strategic narratives and narratives being guides to policy. At what point does it become important that they are rooted in reality, or do they diverge from reality? That is a question which we don't deal with, but obviously ultimately is perhaps an important question. So on that note, I will stop and turn the discussion over to everyone, to Sigrun or whoever wants to intervene.